Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. Today, we're going to talk about how the rise of streaming services has disrupted the movie theater industry and how the two are trying to find a way to play together, but it's proving to not be so simple. As you're probably aware, Scarlett Johansson is suing Disney because the movie she was in, Black Widow, was released in theaters and Disney Plus at the same time. But her back-end compensation was tied to box office revenue, not streaming numbers. The reason this is an issue is because she was under the impression her contract was for a box office release first, then streaming. But Disney disagrees, and she states they changed their mind as they got closer to the release. The result is Scarlett Johansson believes that she lost out on around $50 million in back-end revenue and wants to be compensated for it. Disney once again disagrees, so both will end up in court fighting it out. This specific issue aside, consumer behavior has changed and people want to get their content at home and in theaters. And if you want to keep current, you got to keep up with people's needs and meet them where they're at. Demetrius and I have talked about this for a long time, and today we want to dive in and get even deeper, talk a little bit about our history, and also talk about what's happening right now. Good morning, Dee. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. I think that what you just brought up is really interesting. And one of the things I'll say is that there's definitely this perception that what people are requesting has changed, but I don't really think it has. I think this is what people have always wanted. They want to be able to watch the movies how they want to watch it. Sometimes that means they want to watch it in a theater, and sometimes that means they watch it at home. I mean, look at re-releases of movies like Empire Strikes Back, and they do pretty well in the theater.
Yeah, they do. And, we talked about our history in streaming and on one of our first episodes we did with the podcast about a year ago when we first got started. And we met users way back in the day. And ultimately, what we found from them was the same thing that we're hearing today, which is, can you just meet us where we're at? Can you just give us what we need? I mean, you have people with the most beautiful home entertainment systems at home. They maybe have 2 or 3 kids. It's very expensive and time consuming to go to the movies. And then when you add COVID on top of it, it's just not going to happen. I think the right thing to do is to give them what they want, which is release them on the platform, either charge them extra for it if it happens to be the day that it gets released, or don't, and just provide it to them. They're just looking for content at this point.
Yeah, I think so. Ultimately, I don't think you can necessarily dictate to the user base. You kind of have to ultimately do your best to give them what they want, regardless of whether or not there's some people who want to force them into a theater experience or some of the type of experience, and then just kind of hope for the best. But ultimately, the user is king. So whatever they want, or then you just have to kind of provide them. And from there, for things like a theater experience, if you provide a good theater experience that it is something that's going to be attractive to people, then they'll go to the theater.
Do you think that this lawsuit is kind of just the beginning of this whole, issue between streaming versus in theater, box office numbers versus streaming numbers? Do you think this is just the beginning to all of this stuff unfolding and us trying to figure out a way to, make everybody happy?
I think it's growing pains. I think it's something that when the contract was negotiated, and Scarlett Johansson, I think it's important to point out that she's been in the industry. She's been acting for 3 decades now. She was in movies in the 90s, and she was an executive producer on Black Widow, and she's also has multiple Academy Award nominations. This is not just some box office draw. This is a creative force within the production. So what I would say, what I expect, and I don't have any privileged information on this, but when the contract was negotiated, it was with the understanding that it was going to be theaters first. And then streaming would be released later. And the precedent for these contracts is you get back end on the box office numbers.
Yeah.
The issue is that they had to make that change, which happens on one side of the building with any kind of corporation, like your distribution model changes. and the legal department is in another building. So they are making, or in another part of the building, or another building, especially for Disney, and they aren't necessarily in lockstep with everything else that's going on. So those adjustments need to be made as the distribution changes happen. This happens to us all the time, where sometimes we've actually had to change the design of a product because legal had put something into like a terms of service thing, so we had to accommodate it. Now, I think in the future, I mean, this could have been avoided if they had included, okay, for this is what the compensation would be for streaming, especially for a premium streaming service where there's an upsell to watch Black Widow in the first month or two that it's released, right? I think
Yeah.
they posted something like $30 or $60 million in that first weekend, just from the streaming upsell charges.
Uh-huh.
And if they had included that in the original contract, there would be no issue, I don't think. If they had figured out some kind of offsetting compensation that they had agreed to, then that would also avoid it. I believe that that's what happened with Warner Brothers when they said that they were going to be releasing some of their films, like Wonder Woman 1984, in theaters and on their HBO Max streaming service at the same time. Then they worked out some agreement with the directors and filmmakers and the actors in order to kind of compensate them for the lost box office revenue. I don't know what happened here, but I think one of the things that's going to come out is that they negotiated and they couldn't come to an agreement, and Disney was tired of waiting, so they released it. And then after they released it, then maybe the negotiations weren't getting priority anymore,
Hmm.
which prompted Scarlett Johansson to say, okay, well, now we're going to have to negotiate a settlement instead of just compensation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I feel like you and I have negotiated a lot of contracts, a lot.
Yes.
And I could tell you one thing I learned, and I was thinking about this after I read this whole thing. If it's not in writing, it's not real.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of conversation that happens when you're dealing with attorneys where they say, but the spirit of the contract is. And you're like, and then you would say, okay, if that's the spirit of the contract, please write it in there. And like, well,
Yeah.
we don't want to have to put that directly in there because if we
Sure.
do, and there's a lot of this back and forth and stuff. So I'd be really interested to see the actual like paragraph or lines where it talks about the relationship between sales and back end compensation because um, if Disney's pushing back on it, I wouldn't doubt if it basically had a generalized thing of like, oh, it's in the box office, but it could possibly be in streaming, and then suddenly
Yeah.
they kind of dropped it, on the same day in order to get like a huge uptick in the number of people who are signing up for Disney Plus, right? Because every time Disney and any of these other services drop some amazing movie that everybody wants to see on their streaming service, there's this huge uptick of people signing up for the service.
Yeah. Well, in this case, they actually had to pay $30 per household in order to watch the movie. So they actually have those numbers. What I imagine is that the contract specifically says that it's going to be released in the box office and then streaming afterwards. And if it says that, then there's no argument Disney breached their agreement.
Yeah, but
Um,
then you'll never really know how much it could have made, though.
well, it doesn't really matter. It's just coming down to some kind of agreement in order to reach some kind of compensation. But regardless, if it says in the contract that it's going to have a box office release and that will be followed by streaming release, and that's not how it worked out, then they breached their agreement. And if they didn't institute a change order in their contract, which we do all the time, then that's the proper way to do it. Is like you said, you go to Scarlett Johansson and whoever else has back end compensation. You say, hey, we need to change how this is working. We want to negotiate a change order. Here's what we're thinking. And they say, here's what I'm thinking. And then you negotiate what that looks like. And then you take it to the lawyers and say, okay, draft up the language and make this work.
Yeah.
Um, if you go the other way around and you have the lawyers negotiating, then it can take a lot more time, especially because in our experience, when it comes to legal, that honestly, they're busy. They have a lot of things to do
Yeah.
and their work takes a lot of time. So for us, we've definitely waited a significant amount of time because somebody had to keep pinging legal to get back and pay attention to the contract we needed worked out.
Yeah, I mean, but ultimately, all this stuff is happening because of the fact that things are changing, which we've
Hmm.
talked about forever. And I feel like it's people. I mean, I hate to say this, but they just try to stop change from happening, right? Like, it's so amazing that you can sit in your house on your 70-inch screen or whatever you bought for $599 nowadays, and you can simply push a button and watch your shows. And if something's released on a Friday night, you can pay $10 a person in your household, sit in front of the screen and watch it the day it's released if that's what you want, right? Like,
Hmm.
that sounds like the most amazing user experience that would allow hundreds of millions of people to benefit from the content you're creating. But
Absolutely.
I understand they have these existing relationship with movie theaters. I mean, I have a lot of fun going to movie theaters. I enjoy them. It's
Hmm.
just that I do believe that they should be released in both locations. I think people should have a choice. Like, do I want to go to the movies and sit there and get popcorn and enjoy it with a crowd, or do I want to sit at home and do it? Simple as that.
Yeah. The bottom line, movie theaters have to adapt, because if you don't, then you're just going to be driving users away anyway. Because it's not like movies in general, even streaming, are the only game in town. There's a lot of different places that people can go for entertainment these days.
Absolutely. And we were talking about this earlier. Like, since the pandemic, movie theaters have been on this roller coaster ride, right? And I was looking at Forbes and they did like a breakdown of what happened in 2020. So not 2021, but in 2020, they finally have some kind of firm numbers here. So listen to this and tell me what you think. So in the US, the theatrical home mobile entertainment market totaled about 32 billion. So it's down 11% from 36 billion in 2019. But theatrical entertainment dropped to 2.2 billion, which was accounting for only 7% of the revenue. So if you think about it, in 2019, the revenue for theatrical entertainment was 11.4 billion. It went from 11 billion to 2 billion, right? That's a huge drop. But flip the other side of the coin over and start talking about streaming. Um, there was an increase in online video subscriptions in 2020 with new launches and more content. There were 308 million subscribers, a year-over-year growth of 32%. Revenue from online video subscriptions grew 35% in 2020, totaling 24.7 billion. Everybody switched over, dude. That was it.
Hmm.
Like, that was the moment. That was a hot ticket for streaming, where everyone who builds streaming services and all that kind of stuff doubled down and said, everyone's stuck at home. This is their chance. And this was their chance to give them good quality entertainment. And they did. And those people have stuck, because
Yeah.
those numbers look very similar in 2021, which is people are still really enjoying these new streaming services.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. Like, it is easier and faster, and on a variety of different levels, from both the distribution and from the consumption standpoint, for both users and for studios to reach an audience through streaming. And for theaters, especially during any kind of crisis, whether or not it's an economic disaster, or a sociopolitical disaster, or a pandemic like it is, they're going to get hit. The reality is, if you look at this from a user experience perspective, right? The theaters are like the Lamborghini experience for movie watching, right? You're going because you're going, and you're getting the luxurious maximum experience that you can get when it comes to experiencing that product. As opposed to something that's a little bit more of a daily driver, is your streaming. That Lamborghinis and other supercars, they do well. They're sticking around. They're not going out of business. They get hurt, just like every other kind of luxury experience when it comes to uh, something like a pandemic, or an economic downturn. But they're not going away, and people need to understand that. And theaters, if they can adapt, that it means certain types of content are going to do better in theaters than they will um, than other types of content, and the experience itself needs to change. And they've done that a little bit. And you've got you can get dinner at some places now. They have bars there. They have reclining chairs. There's a lot of elements that they're doing in order to provide some value enhancement to the theater experience.
Yeah, but some of the ones that you're talking about have definitely really been hurting, though, because I think, if I recall reading, right, Alamo Drafthouse filed Chapter 11.
Mm-hmm.
right? And
We
that's one
did.
of those ones you're describing. It was really fun. You go in there, you get your dinner, you get your drinks, you go see a movie. It's a whole experience. But I think that's all just driven by the pandemic, right? So if you took the pandemic out of it, you took COVID out of it, and you said, okay, now you have two options. You can make a whole night of it, or you can stay home and do streaming. I think you're going to see a huge uptick of people going out for sure. But
Hmm.
I think, like you said, it's going to be like the Lamborghini experience. Like, I want to have this amazing, full blown, experience tonight. And tomorrow I might watch something different, but I'm going to stay home. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I
And
think people are overreacting to some of these closures. I mean, you start looking around a little bit, and you can't judge based on pandemic numbers because that's not hopefully barring a permanent pandemic, which has never happened in the history of the world, obviously. Um, it's this too shall pass, and we'll be back to more of a normal lifestyle. But people look at theaters closing, and they're doom and gloom, and they're kind of prisoners of the moment. But at the same time, airlines are needing to be bailed out because otherwise they would shut down. But we're
yeah,
not suggesting that airline travel is going to end as an industry. Same thing with restaurants and gyms and a variety of things. It's a normal outcome of the pandemic, and none of those things are going away. It's just getting through this time period. Sometimes some of the more vulnerable businesses out there go out of business, and new businesses grow up in their shadow.
I looked at this sheet the other day that someone had printed out, and it was all the companies that emerged right after the 2008 collapse.
Hmm.
So these are companies like Airbnb, Uber, like these big huge companies that exist right now that grew right after the financial collapse. And then I started thinking, like, okay, well, we have COVID and everything that's happening with COVID, it keeps happening over and over again. Now we have the Delta variant, and the Lambda or something's on its way, right? So eventually this stuff will die down. I wonder if we're going to look and go, oh, okay, look at all these new companies that emerged, specifically in the entertainment industry, that took advantage of the fact that everybody decided to stay home, and now their behavior changed and they just want to stay home now. Maybe they're nervous to go out. Maybe it's just
Sure.
not worth it anymore. And we're going to see a whole new experience emerge. Maybe it won't even be just at home and movie theaters, but maybe it's going to be VR. Maybe it's going to be something else. Um, because as this continues to linger, this virus, it's making it much more difficult for these movie houses to survive.
Yeah, and it's complicating kind of our understanding of the situation because we have this massive external force that's not it's not standard, right? It's not how things are going to be. But if you take a look at things a bit historically, if you go back to when TV first started up, and people within Hollywood and the filmmakers in the world were very concerned, and they stated this that TV was going to end movies because who would go to the movie theater if you could watch video on a black and white box at home. And obviously that didn't happen. Movies continued to grow. As a matter of fact, if you look at the number of movies produced, they've more than doubled from between 2000, 2018, 2019, from around 400 movies per year in 2000 to 800 movies per year. Now, that's a lot more competition between movies, but it also shows there's a lot more stuff being produced. There's a lot more studios jumping into the game. There's internationally, we're seeing Chinese uh, film production companies producing things for U.S. markets, and um, same thing with productions coming out of other places around the world. I believe some Dubai-based production companies are putting movies out much more for U.S. consumption. That really speaks to this industry is still big now, spread out between theaters versus streaming. That's basically kind of an interface difference, right? Like, are you gonna? It's like the difference between kind of like a keyboard or a mouse. Which one is
Mhm.
better suited for the experience that you want to have at this time? At the same time, what we're seeing is because there's so many more movies being produced, and the same thing's happening with TV shows. Between in the past 10 years, they've more than doubled from 200 to 500. But overall, that means that unless the audience itself is growing dramatically, which it probably is growing, but I don't think it's necessarily growing super dramatically, you're spreading out the audience over more content. So there's a lot more content for roughly the same amount of eyes, which means that it can be more difficult for individual productions to get the viewership and turn a profit. With the move to subscription, it doesn't necessarily depend that much on an individual performance of one production. They can make money off of the collection of productions. So Netflix doesn't necessarily have to look at whether or not a series or a movie that they're producing is individually turning a profit. They just look at whether or not it's helping to drive subscriber growth. So that's one way in which they're kind of modifying that. And it's one of the reasons why we've talked about subscriptions as a model for movie theaters. But we'll see what happens there. But there's definitely going to have to be some kind of adaptation to what is going to be the new normal.
Well, I mean, you could take any of these streaming companies, whether it be Disney or Amazon or anybody, and say, okay, why don't you buy all these movie theaters, and then within the actual subscription, you just give out tickets to everybody.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
I mean, what's wrong with doing that? What's wrong with making it a feature rather than the primary delivery method for revenue, right? And it's really interesting when you talk about that, because it's like it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that someone would produce a ton of content with the idea of how well we're doing collectively rather than how well each film is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Because for so long, it's always like, how much money is this new Titanic going to make? Like everyone's always focusing on the individual film, where with
Mm-hmm.
Netflix, like you said, you're focusing on like the collective investment.
Yeah. To some extent, it's kind of like an album, right? If you're looking at album sales, you're not necessarily looking at the performance of an individual song. You're looking at the bundle.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that makes a really good point. Like I heard about how Netflix will come in and talk to somebody like Adam Sandler and say like, hey, we basically want to buy like 6 films from you. And
Mm-hmm.
then they give them creative control to kind of develop whatever they want, but they can take their premise that they present to them. Like Adam Sandler says, like, "Oh, I want to make a show about grown-ups or something that are, all getting together again after 20 years, like that." And they can take that and they can actually like look at their numbers of people who watch comedies that happen to have people over the age of 45, right? All these kind of things. And they can say, "Yeah, that one's going to do well," and within quite accurately, I think, kind of tell how well the film is going to do, and then they add that number to their collective revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before it even gets produced, right? Like the world has changed in this, and if you think about it, movie theaters are going to get to a point where the only thing they can really show are the ones that they absolutely know are going to do well.
Yeah, there's going to be a classification of films, right? Some of them are going to be um, movie theater films. Those are going to be like the Marvels and the Fast and the Furious and Star Wars kind of media franchises, or every now and then we're going to see some kind of in gaming what you refer to as original IP because it's launching a new franchise, right? It's not just one production; it's a series of them. There's merchandise. There's all kinds of things around it. But we'll see things like a Christopher Nolan original movie come out and establish the new franchises. They're going to invest in new stuff, but it will. I think the theaters will be driven by kind of franchise level content where they feel like they're confident that they can recoup their costs. And
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to have within streaming probably different levels of productions also, where you have a heavily marketed kind of front runner like a Stranger Things versus more of a kind of a sleeper that will still draw eyes in or keep people on the service in order to watch something, but they're not necessarily like one of these kind of AAA kind of titles.
Well, you know how this is going to turn out. This is basically going to be the way Silicon Valley like tests, validates like startup companies, where it's like let's say you come up with a script idea. Let's say it gets greenlit by any studio, it doesn't really matter. Let's say, and then it gets produced, it gets put on a streaming service, it gets really popular on that streaming service, so they add, a few more, and then once you have millions and millions of people that are excited about this particular film, then you get a call. Guess what?
Yeah,
Your next film is going to be in the box office.
yeah. I think a little bit. I'm reminded a little bit about how kind of anime and manga has their relationship with each other and also with Hollywood. So I'll talk through it a little bit if people aren't familiar with it. So manga, if you get into the history of it, started up in post World War II, and it was became popular because it was really really cheap to produce, right? And they were heavily influenced by Western comics and so on, as well as Walt Disney and animation. But they did well because it was cheap to produce. And it still does well, partially because it's cheap to produce. It's usually one person or a small team of people producing these comics, and then they get released. And if they do well, you have your market test done very cheaply. If it does well, it gets elevated to an anime. Now, an anime, because it's animation, is cheaper to produce than live action. So you still have something that provides a market test because it's being released, and you can see whether or not it will do well for reduced costs relative to a full production.
Yeah.
The animes that do really well get turned into live action. So then you start seeing now it's a higher level of cost because it's done well at a lower level of cost to produce. And you can then have some kind of branding around it because people have picked up a following from anime and manga. And some of them, like movies like Paprika, have been, or Ghost in the Shell, and they've been talking about Akira forever, get elevated to the Hollywood blockbuster release. Alita Battle Angel is an example where it gets
Mm-hmm.
made by a U.S. studio and released, and they've had different levels of quality come out of that. But it is kind of like this way for new ideas to get introduced, and they get vetted through low cost production methods and develop an audience at a lower cost, and then get move its way up the chain to like a big budget theater release.
Yeah, I mean that's a good model though, right? If you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's basically just following the data. It's like as things become more and more popular, right? They get more and more
Yeah,
opportunities to grow.
it's not that different from kind of how a startup will try to do a limited release or within a certain market, and if it does well, then they expand to new markets.
Yeah. Hey, I want to add on what you were saying earlier too. You were talking about how the number of shows has doubled from around 200 to around 500 in less than 10 years. I was reading some articles, which we will post on Twitter. All these ones we will post on Twitter after this episode drops. Is in the LA Times. I've done a few stories already about more and more studios are being built in LA. So a lot of people have heard these stories about like everything's moving out of LA, it's going to Canada, like this kind of stuff. Well, that's kind of turning around. It's kind of changing again because there's so many streaming services that exist and so much content being produced. There's not enough sound stages in order to make these shows. And so Echelon Studios is addressing this by building sound stages in Hollywood. They're going to replace I think the old Sears building on Santa Monica Boulevard and put a sound stage there. There's one I think coming up in Culver City. I think they're doing one in New York City as well. It's just there's not enough space to produce all these shows,
Yeah,
and that's really exciting. It's kind of a new birth or growth in LA of the film industry again. It always has its kind of ups and downs over the last 100 years, but like I think it's 100 years, right? Yeah, around 100 years. And now we're seeing another growth period again, and a lot of it has to do with companies like Apple and Amazon and Roku and all these others that are producing their own shows.
yeah, absolutely. I remember when you first told me about this, I was like, "Wait, you mean there's going to be movie studios producing content in LA? I mean, could it work there?" Just as a joke,
Well,
but
I know,
I think
but
I,
I was like, what do you mean? I was like, this is it. They've been kind of running dry a little bit for a while.
Well, I think there's a perception, but I think they've been producing there a lot. Obviously, it's kind of been the story that they've been expanding out, but it's never been the case. Kind of like with Silicon Valley when people talk about like, oh, well, what about Silicon Alley? or what about Austin, or what about Seattle? It's like, yes, these places are growing, but it hasn't really impacted like Silicon Valley, right? It's
Yeah.
just been spreading out. It's not like Silicon Valley has been shrinking. I think the same thing with LA. I don't think it's necessarily the case that LA based production has gone away. It's just kind of expanded. I think it's good for the industry for them to expand into other areas. Same thing with Silicon Valley. It's good for it to expand into other areas. It brings in fresh perspective. It gives people who work in the industry options of different places to live and to have different experiences and bring those experiences back into the work. But it's also great that these other companies, new studios, with the Apples, the Amazons, the Netflixes, to have their LA based production, because the culture in LA around film production is just, it's just different. There's no other place in the world like it. Like every
No.
single person you run into in LA is working on like movie production. They're all artists. They're all actors or producers or composers or everything else. It's just, it's so much the air that they breathe there. And I think for studios or for any organization to have a presence there as well as have a presence outside of Hollywood and LA is good for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the last time you and I were in LA, we were working on a project. Man, we can't talk about it, but it was a very interesting streaming project. But we were bouncing around, and it's so cool how this was before the pandemic. You would go into a coffee shop. There's a lot of what's that one that's really is it Coffee Bean? The one that's really popular in
Yeah,
LA?
coffee
Yeah,
bean
Coffee Bean,
tea.
right? Yeah, and everywhere you look, someone is typing on their laptop. But what's interesting about it is like if you walk up and you say hi to them or you kind of ask them what they're up to, it's always like, oh, I'm writing a script or like editing these lines for an actor and stuff. It's not like someone sitting on Slack, like doing tech work, right? It's like
Yeah,
literally Southern California, Northern California. You go into coffee shops. Over here, everyone's just pounding away, like writing code or like handling meetings or whatever it is. And over there, everybody's writing scripts and doing creative things. It's so cool to see. And then I had this really interesting idea. Here's what we should do. So we should move to LA, and then because we closed our office D here recently because of the pandemic, we couldn't go anymore, and so D and I put a pause on it temporarily. We should get an office in a bungalow at a movie studio. Wouldn't that be cool? Just like from the creative aspect of like we're going into our bungalow to go work during the day, but like we see all these people like doing movie production and all that kind of stuff, like on the Sony lot or like the Universal lot or something like that. I think that'd be exciting.
it would be. But just yesterday, you promised me an office in Hawaii, so I guess we can try to target a bungalow on a movie production area in Hawaii since they produce stuff there. But like, that's a tough choice. That's a tough choice.
Yeah,
Hawaii and the
which one are you going to pick? Because the thing I was dangling over to you yesterday was I said maybe we should move the podcast to Hawaii, so then we would just be flying between LA and Hawaii all the time.
so we fly to Hawaii in order to report a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. And then there you go. It's like live from Hawaii. Actually, we should do that. The next time we're together in Hawaii, we should do a live podcast from there. I think people would totally dig it. And we should interview someone who's doing something really interesting in tech that's local.
Yeah, we absolutely should. Hawaii is an area that I think is absolutely underutilized for a variety of things, including tech and for film production.
So I have this other question about TV and movies. I know that you were kind of digging into this stuff a little bit. So are movies and TV truly getting hammered by other social services like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Twitch? You know what I mean? Like, if is there
Yeah,
any numbers that indicate that like when those started to emerge, suddenly there was a decrease in the amount of viewership or anything like that?
I don't know about the decrease in viewership because we don't necessarily have all those numbers, right? Those are all locked behind. Those are corporate data that we don't have access to. And if we did have access to them, we couldn't tell anybody.
Yeah.
But if you just look at the engagement, right? You could be on Instagram and watching a movie at the same time. You could be watching something on TikTok and have a movie on at the same time. But you generally look at some of these things that tend to be more exclusive. Like YouTube has grown dramatically, Twitch has grown dramatically. Gaming in general has grown massively. Gaming is much, much bigger than the film industry right now,
Yeah.
from revenue and from just market capitalization. Now that had to come from somewhere, right? Back in the '80s, gaming was on life support, and now it's bigger than movies. And it's not like you're going to be playing, Doom Eternal while you're watching a movie, at least not very often. And then you look also at other areas that are growing, like podcasts and audiobooks. It's not like you're going to be listening to a podcast and watching a movie at the same time, at least not something that you're paying for.
Yeah.
So it just stands to reason that as these are growing, they're cutting into other forms of entertainment because you're only going to engage in one at a time. And when it comes to movies and TV, so many people are focused on this, streaming versus theater argument, and I think it is more kind of movies and produced video as a whole versus everything else.
Yeah.
Because if you look at like when Netflix started carrying TV shows, they had this whole thing called the Netflix effect. And the original idea was like, well, why would people watch the TV shows on cable channels or the broadcast TV channels if they can just stream it on Netflix? But what actually happened was some shows that didn't have a lot of attention, like Breaking Bad, they got picked up. They picked up an audience on Netflix, and it drove the audience on the network and cable channels. And the same thing is going to happen when it comes to streaming. Like you're watching all of these Marvel shows. Disney's killing it, by the way, because they've got so much Marvel content coming out and so much Star Wars content coming out over the next 2 years. And it's going to drive the theater going experience when things open up again. I've heard so many people tell me stories about how their friend or family member got into WandaVision or Loki when they had never been into Marvel before, and now they're big Marvel fans.
Yeah, they're broadening their base big time.
Yeah.
People that have never even ever discussed it with me are now discussing it with me. Yeah, it's pretty amazing what they've done. Um, but before we wrap up, because this has been super interesting, I feel like you and I really gel well when we're talking about entertainment and stuff. I think it's because we're both so interested in it that we do so much research without even having a podcast slated, right? That we can just kind
That's
of
true.
jump in on this stuff, which is a lot of fun. But couple things I wanted to have some fun with. So the first one is, what would you say is the most exciting film to be released in the next 6 months? The one that you think is going to just be blow everyone away.
Like an upcoming film, you mean? That's
Yeah, yeah. I have a couple fun questions for you. So, what upcoming
all right.
film do you
Well,
think is going to change things and totally get everyone really excited about movies and stuff?
the one that I am really fascinated for, it's probably not a huge surprise considering my relationship with these franchises, but Marvel's Eternals, where you have this amazing cast, this story that most comic book enthusiasts aren't that familiar with, right? Not a ton of people that I know in the comics world have read the Eternals.
Mm-hmm.
But then you throw in Chloe Zhao, and
Yeah.
this is an amazing director with a. This is the first film that's going to be directed, first Marvel film that's going to be directed by an Academy Award winning director. Um, and the trailer looks amazing. Like the first trailer came out, the teaser trailer, and I said, okay, this is interesting, but I'm not invested in these characters. I don't know them from the comics very well. The second one came out, and you got a sense of where the story was going and kind of the pathos that exists for these characters that can stand by and watch all the suffering in the world, and they're forbidden from doing anything about it. And it's so fascinating to me at this point. I think it is something that they timed up the release for Oscar season, and I don't think that's an accident.
No, and I saw that trailer too, and I was like, "Whoa!" Like it was almost like when I saw the first Iron Man trailer, and it like got me sucked in. I was like, "This looks amazing." Right? So I'm excited about that one as well. Um,
So what are you excited about? What release, or did I just steal your thunder?
no, you did not steal my thunder. I'm all about nostalgia.
Oh
So
god. I
Ghostbusters.
know where this is going. Yeah.
Okay, Ghostbusters. Oh, with Paul Rudd, the new one. Oh my God. It looks so good. I'm so excited about it. I was a huge Ghostbusters fan when I was a kid, and this one looks unbelievable. I cannot wait for it. And then, wait for it, D. The
I
new
know
new
exactly where you're
Top
going.
Gun. That's
Yep,
right.
yep. Top
Yeah.
Gun Maverick. So
I
here's the
know.
thing, right? I love Top Gun. I'm sad that Tony Scott is not here to direct the movie.
I know.
I loved his work. I'm a little worried that it's going to be a little bit like it's going to be like the Mummy, and it's just like a hope that Tom Cruise can just let the movie be what it needs to be and not try to convince everybody that he's still 25 years old. So,
He looks
but
25.
he does not like 25. Uh, but I have high hopes for it. I don't understand enough about it. Like who are we dogfighting with in 2021? I don't
I don't
know.
know. That's the mystery, D. That's the exciting part. They're not going to tell us anything until it gets released. All right, next question. What is your favorite show that you're watching right now? And you only get to pick one.
God, what? Only one.
Only one.
I'm gonna do an honorable mention. I'm gonna cheat a little bit. Uh, Mythic Quest. If you haven't seen Mythic Quest, go watch
So
Mythic
good.
Quest. I love Mythic Quest. Everybody loves Ted Lasso. I haven't started second season yet, just because we're too busy. But I think Mythic Quest has a similar kind of hopeful feel to it, um, and it has some great performances. Right now, I'm gonna sound like a major Marvel fanboy, but I'm loving What If. Um, it's really got a playful feel to it that I guess a lot of times the Marvel series has a Marvel franchises have a playful tone to it, but the narrative elements are always really nailed down so that they can kind of flow one into the other. And this one is just kind of like, all right, well, now we can play around with that. We don't necessarily have to kind of fit into a box, and it's a really interesting way to go.
Yeah, that's a good one. I have to say Ted Lasso. It's so good, dude. I mean, the
Way way
second
to
this
way to swing for the underdog there.
well, no, here's the thing. So Mythic Quest, I'm like way into it because you recommended it. So I had never even heard of Mythic Quest until you said it. And then I started watching it and it's awesome. It's just such an awesome show. Ted Lasso, though, brings this level of like positivity and lightness that I kind of feel like is needed right now. It's like, I get thrown in my face all the time, COVID numbers and this and that. And it's nice to sit down and watch something that'll make you smile. I have
Yeah,
to tell you, I'm into season 2 already. I know you haven't started yet, but there's an episode in season 2 that takes place during the holiday season. It's a little early that they did it, but it's still, I mean, whatever. But it is so good that I actually think this is something that you would watch every year during the holiday season. This
yeah.
one episode.
I'm looking forward to it. It's just something that we haven't gotten around to yet. But it is absolutely on the slate. There's so many things we haven't gotten around to. We are in the middle of watching Invincible, and that one's great. That one came out a while ago now.
Uh huh.
We haven't gotten to watch like Mayor of Easttown or any of those things. We're so behind on everything.
All right.
Everybody's so busy.
Final question. You have to
All
be
right.
super honest. What is your guilty pleasure that you're watching that maybe you don't tell everyone you're watching?
I mean, there's not that much. Honestly, I've been watching a lot of Minecraft YouTube videos.
I knew it. I knew it. That's the one that I was gonna say. If you didn't say anything, I was gonna say,
All right.
you've been sending me a lot of links of people creating cool Minecraft builds.
Well, here's the thing: that the creativity of some of these Minecrafters just blows my mind, right? And I work with professional designers all the time, and the stuff that some of these people are developing is just absolutely insane. Like the technical aspect of things and the creative aspect of things, not to mention just the storytelling element of things. Like there's a series called Hermitcraft. They have a massive amount of views, and it's mind blowing the stuff that they do. But there was kind of a spin off series by a lot of the same people within that series called Third Life.
Okay.
And I watched that, and I was like, "This needs to be like an HBO show. Somebody needs to adapt this story because these independent YouTube uh, YouTubers creating stuff in their house just created an amazing, compelling storyline. It's it's really kind of surprising. And of course, I tell anybody who's my own age about Minecraft stuff, and they roll their eyes at me because it's for their kids. But there's awesome stuff going on,
It's kind
and
of
it's
not
amazing
though.
to me that Minecraft is still doing so well after all this time.
Yeah, I mean, like my son plays Minecraft with a Minecraft group at his actual school, and then in
Hmm.
addition to that, he has other Minecraft players that he plays with, which are my friends that are in their 40s.
Yeah,
So it's a broad range there, but also it Minecraft reminds me a little bit of Pixar. Yes, it's for kids, but it's actually for adults. Like,
yeah. Well, it's like Legos, right?
yeah, it's like Legos, yeah.
Like let your imagination go. And my brother, I get him Legos. I mean, he's like 45 or something now, but I get him Legos all the time for birthdays and Christmas and things, and he loves it. He plays with it with the kids. Sometimes he has things that are like too complex and big for the kids, like
Hmm.
a X-wing fighter or something like that. But yeah, it's something that appeals to all ages.
Exactly. I'll tell you what my guilty pleasure is.
Yeah, what is
I,
your
I don't know
guilty
how
pleasure?
I got hooked on this. I think I saw a preview for it and I was like, oh, uh, I think it's Tay Diggs that's in it, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Caught my attention. Like Netflix does this; it'll do that auto preview, and then I'll end up watching one episode. It's called All American, and apparently there's like 4 seasons of it. It's about a high school football team, and
Yeah.
Tay Diggs is the coach and all this stuff. It's super addicting. Like after you watch like one episode, you're like, I want to find out what happens in that next season game. And then you watch it again, and then you watch it again. Next thing I know, I'm 11 episodes in.
Somebody else told me about that. I think my aunt told me that she was getting really into it. It's funny how much sports, for something that's unscripted, lends itself so well to a narrative storyline, and it's because there are just there's just human experience built into it.
Well, it's inspired by a true story too, which is kind
Mm.
of interesting if you look it up. But it's just so interesting. I don't know. It's something about the dynamics of a football team, but also kind of the social aspects. But also, it's taking place in LA, and I don't know. It just connected all the
Yeah,
pieces together. And next thing I know, I'm like 11 episodes in. And I was like, yeah, I got to keep going.
yeah. Well, I love me a good like Rudy movie.
Exactly, right? That's basically like the format, right? So
Yeah.
I think this is a wrap for today, D. This has been super fun. Thanks to everyone so much for taking the time to listen. We really appreciate it. We will be posting our links to many of the sources that we referenced on Twitter. So you can find us there and follow us at the X Podcast One. That's the X Podcast and the number one. If you like this podcast, found it interesting or informative, it helps us a great deal if you subscribe or leave a review on whatever platform you use. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you all next week.